So welcome all of you to our very first When Readies Retire event of this academic year. This event is hosted by the Foster-Scholz Club, but it's open to all because retirement hopefully applies to everyone eventually. I'm really pleased to welcome you here today to hear from our speakers, Professor Emeritus Wally Englert, and several of your peers, Diane Solomon, Charlie Averill, and Carrie Booth, who are representing kind of a gamut of different retirement experiences. Before we begin, I have a little bit of housekeeping to share with you. Most of us are pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but if you're having any trouble, please do use the chat feature to reach out to me. When you use the chat, note that you can direct a message to others or you can send a message to everyone. So you can message me directly or everyone. If you have any comments or questions as we go, feel free to share those in the chat. I'll make sure that we cycle back up to anything that gets mixed. I do want to note that this conversation is designed to be participatory. We're going to try to get all of you involved. I don't want you to be totally off guard when I offer the opportunity for everyone to speak. And when we move into breakout rooms so we can chat in smaller groups, I don't want you to be shocked by the fact that you might have to turn on your camera and have a little bit of conversation. If you want to stay muted and stay off camera, that's fine. You might stick out a little, but that's okay. That's also an option. I'm also going to note that we did have some homework before this meeting. I sent along some articles by Arthur Brooks and David Brooks from The Atlantic that explore some of the concepts that we're going to talk about today. If you didn't have a chance to read them, that's okay. This is Read. You don't have to do the homework to participate in the conversation. We've all done it. But if you want to revisit those in the future, I've dropped those in the chat. Some people really liked them. Some people really didn't like them, and that's okay. Again, this is Read. We all have opinions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the stage over to Professor Englert, who's going to set the stage a little bit on the concepts of the mythological heroic journey that we're each tracing in our own lives.
Great. Thanks very much, Tess. And it's really a pleasure to be here, to have a chance to talk on this topic. And also, I think we'll find there'll be some elements of Hume 110 from our various years that sneak into the talk when we talk about Homeric heroes. So what I'm going to do in my talk is kind of go through 4 sections. The first, we're going to look at Arthur Brooks's article. I'll call him Arthur, since we have 2 Brooks as authors on the 2 articles that we read. And we're going to talk a little bit about the way he discusses retirement in the context of the hero's journey. Then we'll look at some actions and thoughts of some Homeric heroes who might help us think about what a Homeric retirement would look like. And then we'll turn to David Brooks, I'll call him David, his article on new programs that help successful people make a transition to retirement. And then finally, I'll say just a few things about my own retirement and how it's been going. So Arthur Brooks, in his 2020 article that we may have had a chance to read or not, suggests that many successful people's career patterns can be viewed as sort of a hero's journey. According to Arthur, it was the 19th century anthropologist Edward Burnett Taylor who first identified the hero's journey in literature, which he said consists of 3 parts: the call to adventure, the ordeal in which the hero is brutally tested, and the victory where the hero gets to return home triumphant. But Arthur Brooks goes on to focus on a 4th, final stage of life, what Joseph Campbell called the crossing of the return threshold, when the returning hero, once home, has to face the realities and banalities of everyday life. Arthur describes this final stage after the hero's journey, or after one begins retirement, as a final battle with one's demons. Win that final battle, he says, the hardest one of all, and true victory in retirement is yours. The important thing to do in retirement, Arthur concludes, is not to blow it in that final stage of life. He uses the example of King David falling victim to his lust at the end of his life, or any of us giving into vanities, desires, and insecurities. The article ends by advocating showing, and this is a quote, true strength and character in this final phase, end quote, and spending the last part of life serving others, loving your family and friends, and being a good example to those still in the last 3 stages of your own hero's journey. So that's just kind of setting up one model of what the hero's journey is and kind of how it applies to our own lives. What I want to do now is just to think about the Homeric examples that at some time in the past all of us met in the Iliad and or the Odyssey, and look at the lives and actions of Achilles, Odysseus, and Penelope. Let's think about the final stages of Achilles' hero's journey. Well, we know he was the greatest warrior at Troy, and the Iliad is set in the last year of that 10-year war. We learn a lot about Achilles as a hero, and surprisingly, about his retirement options in the poem. As Book 1 opens, Achilles is the greatest hero fighting at Troy. Achilles uses his great skills as a warrior to kill as many Trojans as possible, help the Greeks as they strive to defeat the Trojans, and personally to gain as much time or honor, kudos or glory, and kleos or fame as possible. In Book 1, a huge disagreement arises, as you remember, between Achilles and Agamemnon. Agamemnon insults Achilles, and Achilles is enraged and withdraws from battle, refusing to fight for most of the epic. In Book 9, the Greeks send an embassy of 3 warrior friends of Achilles to try to persuade him to return to battle. After the first speaker, Odysseus, tells Achilles about all the incredible gifts and honors that Agamemnon has promised him if he returns to battle, Achilles angrily rejects the offer, showing that he is now envisioning 2 possible life paths, either fighting and dying at Troy, or leaving and going back home to Phthia, his homeland in Greece. He tells the member of the Greek embassy, and this is Emily Wilson's translation from Book 9. This is what Achilles says. My silver-footed goddess mother Thetis says that there are 2 ways my death may come. If I stay here and fight, besieging Troy, my chance of ever going home is lost, but I shall have a name that lasts forever. Or if I go home to my own dear country, I lose my glory, but I gain a long life. So Achilles stands at a crossroads, we might say, a crossroads of retirement. Homer doesn't use that exact term. But anyway, Achilles realizes that he can either, number one, not retire from being a warrior, keep fighting at Troy, die young, and win everlasting glory. Or the second option is to retire to his home in Greece, support his father as his father ages, marry, have a family, and a long life of peace, but completely forego glory and fame. And now, as we remember from Hume 110, Achilles does in fact remain at Troy and chooses the glory forever retirement option. But in so doing, he has to forfeit living a long and peaceful life at home with his family. Now here the retirement story of Achilles ends, or almost ends. The Homeric tradition takes a second look at Achilles' retirement choice in the Odyssey, Book 11, when Odysseus visits the underworld. While Odysseus is in the underworld, one of the shades he meets is that of Achilles. Odysseus greets Achilles warmly, calling him the greatest of the Greek heroes. Odysseus tells Achilles, and this is a quote, I, Odysseus, have had bad luck, but no one's luck was ever better than yours, Achilles, nor ever will be. In your life, we Greeks respected you as we do gods. And now that you are here, you have a great power among the dead. Achilles, you should not be bitter at your death. But Achilles replied, Odysseus, you must not comfort me for death. I would prefer to be a workman, hired by a poor man on a peasant farm, than rule as king of all the dead. Achilles in the Odyssey, perhaps shockingly, clearly has second thoughts about the retirement path he chose in the Iliad, and seems to question whether he made the right choice for his life after all. And I think that's where the poem leaves us with Achilles in his retirement is, what do we make of what Achilles has said? Now we'll just look at two more Homeric heroes, Odysseus's and Penelope's retirement plans. So Odysseus in the Odyssey, unlike Achilles in the Iliad, gets to choose a different ending to his story. After fighting bravely at Troy, in the Odyssey we see that he survives the war and sails for Ithaca, little knowing what's in store for him on his travels and when he returns home. Odysseus is a very different hero from Achilles. Odysseus is called Polytropos in the first line of the Odyssey, Polytropos meaning a man of many devices or many twists and turns. And Odysseus is continually associated with the Greek quality of metis, or cunning intelligence, a virtue characteristic also of the goddess Athena, and, as we'll see in a few minutes, Odysseus' wife Penelope. Odysseus is seen throughout the poem as clever, resourceful, wily, deceitful, and taking on many disguises and false identities, all in an effort to stay alive and attain his ultimate goal, to get home safely to his wife Penelope and his family on Ithaca, to slaughter the suitors that are besieging his palace, and to reclaim the title of King of Ithaca. As we read the Odyssey, it often looks like Odysseus is not going to make it home. He faces many fantastic and dangerous adventures until all his ships have been destroyed and all of his men lost. But during his journey, Odysseus has choices to make about what kind of retirement he wants to have. First, should he choose to continue home to Ithaca to defeat the suitors and save Penelope and his family? Or, as another option, should he stay in one of the places he visits on his way home? And probably especially attractive is the island of Ogygia, where the beautiful goddess Calypso detains him for 7 years and offers him immortality, but without fame or glory. He kind of drops out of the knowledge of men if he chooses to stay with Calypso. So Odysseus rejects Calypso's offer and other possible heroes' paths, and succeeds in getting back home, disguised as a beggar by Athena, so he would arrive at his palace and witness how Penelope's suitors were pressuring her to marry them and were eating away the wealth of his palace. The disguised Odysseus is pleased to find Penelope still waiting for him, Telemachus trying to hold on until his father comes home, and some female and male servants who remain loyal to Penelope and to him. Odysseus, with the goddess Athena's help, slays the suitors and unfaithful servants, and ready for a settled life back home, finally tries to reveal his real identity to Penelope. Penelope is not so sure. Who is this Penelope who has been waiting steadfastly for her husband Odysseus? Penelope is described as having been very young when Odysseus sailed for Troy, probably in her teens. While Odysseus was away, she had no idea what had happened to him, but she still continued to wait. Few people could have survived what she did as part of her hero's journey. She kept the palace functioning, raised a son alone for 20 years, and fended off the suitors. She demonstrated many of the same qualities that Odysseus had as he fought to return to Ithaca: metis, again cunning intelligence, wariness, and craftiness. Perhaps the greatest demonstration of Penelope's cunning intelligence is how she deceived the suitors with her weaving. She told the suitors she would choose one of them to marry as soon as she finished weaving a death shroud for Laertes, Odysseus' aged father. She fended the suitors off for 3 years with this ruse, weaving the shroud during the day and unweaving parts of it during the night. The suitors eventually discovered her trick, but it brought her 3 precious years as she waited for Odysseus. They are thus both amazing heroes, and in Book 23 we see them reunited after Odysseus kills the suitors. Odysseus stands before her, but still, as we remember, Penelope reserves judgment, being wise and wary, so as not to be tricked by this possible stranger who claims to be Odysseus. Finally, she finds the perfect test to see if this man is indeed her husband. She tells the servant Eurycleia to move their bed from their bedroom so he can sleep that night in the hall. Odysseus is surprised and shocked. Who could have moved their bed when he himself had constructed it with a living olive tree for one of its bedposts? Penelope then instantly recognizes Odysseus, and since only he would have known the secret of their bed. In the end, Odysseus and Penelope are together seen to share one further Greek quality, homophrosyne, literally a unity of heart, or thinking alike. Not only are they shown to have their own individual heroic qualities, but to share them together and almost to be perfect partners. But where does this leave Odysseus and Penelope as they live through their life into old age? What kind of retirement will it be? When Odysseus had been in the underworld in Odyssey Book 11, Tiresias had told him that once he got back to Ithaca and he had taken care of the suitors, he needed to do one more thing before he could live peacefully in Ithaca. He needed to travel far inland until people didn't recognize what a ship's oar looked like, and then he would have to make a final supplication to Poseidon. Then Odysseus, Tiresias prophesied, gentle death will come to you, far from the sea, a comfortable old age, your people flourishing. So it will be. The Odyssey makes clear then that Odysseus and Penelope's like-mindedness, intelligence and endurance and cunning, among many other qualities, ensure that they both achieve the retirement that they most desire. Thus we see that Odysseus, Penelope, and Achilles on their heroic journeys not only face many struggles, but also face many choices as they look forward to their retirement. Now we'll just move to the last article we looked at by David Brooks, The New Old Age. In his article, The New Old Age, David, as I'll call him, examines how to make the transition to retirement by looking at the success of a number of programs started at elite institutions, including Stanford, Harvard, Notre Dame, and Chicago, for successful men and women making the transition from their intense, successful careers to the next stage of their lives. David's article approaches retirement differently than Arthur's hero's journey and what we looked at in the Homeric heroes do. Rather than focusing on how individuals see their lives as a hero's journey, David talks instead about how these programs, in effect, set the stage for a new type of hero's journey as they transition from their successful careers they had had to what they were going to do in what David calls their encore years. David talks about how participants must learn, in these programs, must learn to shed their former workism and start over again. The starting over entails being vulnerable to their fellow participants, writing or telling a narrative of their life journey so far, and moving through a three-stage process. A period of loss of former selves, second, a period in a neutral zone, and third, a period of rebirth. And there are more details in his article, but I wanted to highlight just a few things about what it adds to our discussion of the hero's journey. Kind of what new things does he offer as ideas for retirement? Well, unlike the heroic journey described in the earlier article, and those Homer depicts, the process in the programs David describes are communal efforts, and I want to stress the communal part of that. The work that the participants do in the programs is supported by their fellow participants. They do it as a group, and the people running the programs who are there to kind of help coach them. The programs also require vulnerability and honesty. And this is not easy, I think, for people as they start the programs, as participants admit that they feel like they're failing in retirement. and feel lost and estranged from their former selves. Once the participants begin moving towards the next phase of their lives, according to David, they have to update their own life stories. In other words, to tell a tale of how from childhood on they grew and changed and came to the point where they're at this stage in their lives. And then they don't just write the story, but they share these stories with the other participants. Again, processing their own story by telling their story to others and getting reactions from other people and hearing about their stories. Finally, David describes how the participants must learn to move from what he calls a career logic that dominated their professional or work lives to a gift logic, which helps us to serve others. Now, this process, and I'm leaving out obviously a number of details, but this process is different from the heroic journeys we see in Homer. It is hard to imagine, for instance, Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, Helen, Odysseus, and Penelope traveling to Athens after their heroic journeys are over to participate in a year-long program on how to transition from one kind of Homeric heroism to a different sort of life. And it's okay. And with that, I'll just turn to a few remarks about my retirement journey. I retired from teaching at Reed in 2018. I had taught at Reed for 37 years, and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. I love my colleagues and my students, and so it was a real decision to retire, as it is, I think, for almost every Reed faculty member who's taught at Reed. I decided to retire when I turned 66, grateful for my time at Reed, and feeling I had been able to achieve at Reed what I wanted to as a teacher and a scholar. I also retired, and this is probably almost is actually just as important when I did, because something else was calling me. I had become increasingly worried over the years about the problem of climate change, and didn't feel like, after teaching for so long, that I really had enough time to both teach and devote, volunteer hours as much as I wanted when I was, still teaching full time. I expected when I started working on climate change that I'd be able to contribute my efforts to, somehow making a difference in climate change issues, but that notion was very vague in my mind. How was I going to do this? I didn't really know. I began volunteering with the Sierra Club and working in the office here in Portland. I went through, along with my wife, Al Gore's climate reality training programs, and then we gave climate talks to groups until COVID hit, and that sort of put a stop to that kind of activity. And then lately I've become involved in another group called the Laudato Si movement, a worldwide organization started after Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si. And what appealed to me about that program is that it's worldwide, and you really get, through Zoom at these meetings, to talk to people all over the world about what's happening in their country about climate change. I was surprised, though, that I haven't felt my volunteering efforts are as successful as I'd hoped. And I still say I'm kind of yearning to figure out, and maybe there is no perfect way to engage with the problem of climate change, but anyway, still trying to figure out how to do it in the most effective way. Given how serious the problem of climate change is and how quickly we have to move forward on it, I underestimated, I think, the amount of opposition there would be to fighting climate change, especially in the US, and that's been very depressing to me. And to conclude, final thought, where have I found meaning and purpose in retirement? Well, definitely in my climate change work, because I feel best when I'm actually doing something and working on a problem. But I've also taken up a musical instrument, which I never have played a musical instrument before, the banjo. And I'm terrible on the banjo, but I love being terrible and having the time to be terrible as I try and get a little bit better with it. I belong to a book group where we take turns selecting books, and it's wonderful. And then, most meaningfully, getting to spend more time with family, with my spouse, children, and grandchildren, and good friends. Thanks very much, and I really appreciate being here.
Thank you so much, Wally, for both providing this really lovely framework as well as kind of giving us a jumping off place to then look at other folks' experience as well. I want to turn here to Carrie Booth, who I think has a fairly similar type of story. And Carrie, you chose differently than Achilles. You pursued family, you entered retirement, maybe a little earlier than you expected, and kind of avoided some of that long-term glory. What led you to the decision to retire when you did?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I loved your story, Wally. So you've got banjo, I'm playing the baritone ukulele, lots of singing, and climate change. I'm all about volunteering and a sustainability theme. So we got a lot of parallels there. I retired in July of 2020. I was only 62. I loved my job teaching in labs for 31 years. It was a hard decision when to retire, and I kept struggling, going, how will I know? When will I know? And I was running a lot of models about the money end of it, which is not anything about the emotional end of it, but do you have the money to make this happen reasonably? And I used a tool called FIRE, F-I-R-E, Calc, CALC.com. Steve Black turned me on to this thing. And it's amazing. It has all kinds of buttons and it runs Monte Carlo simulations. And I kept running it and thinking, oh, I should save some more money the last couple of years leading up to when I finally retired. And at that moment, though, when it kept telling me you have 100% chance of not outliving your money, basically anything I would throw at it. What if I spend this much? What if I live this long? What if I save more or less? It just kept saying, you're there, you're there. And then the whole equation sort of flipped itself on its head for me. I grew up very poor. I put myself through Reed. I thought, oh, I'll have to work till I'm 70, no question about it. And when the model was telling me, actually, you have enough now, then I started thinking, oh, I actually have to give this job to someone who needs it. I cannot ethically keep working at a job just because I like it, just because I want to have more money, just in case, or so I can become the extravagant person I've never been. And it became very evident that it was time to give that job to someone who needed it. And I miss my students. I still get to run into them all over town and all over the country when I'm traveling. Sometimes I run into students, so that's fun. I still get to see the biology faculty that I work so closely with. Some of them I see every Tuesday night singing at Sarah Schock's house. We need a banjo player, Wally, by by the way. And so it really was this concept of I have enough. People in the world need jobs. I can't just hoard this job. And I did have a lot of other goals and ideas. I was already volunteering some, and I thought I can ramp that up. Solar energy, electric vehicles. I'm a master recycler, electrify PDX, helping people make a plan to get off the gas line. And I pick up food every week for urban gleaners. So we're not wasting food and we're getting it to people who need it for free. So that's meaningful, and then all sorts of fun stuff: ping pong, roller skating, cross country skiing, mountain biking. So that's been really worthwhile. And the challenges along the way is, I retired in July of 2020. It was COVID. All my students got sent home in the middle of March. And I had given 13 months notice, because when you work someplace for 31 years, you don't just give 2 weeks notice. And when you're only 62, it was a shock to the system because they thought I had at least a few more years. And I could have, but it just was better this way. And besides COVID, there were a couple of close family members with a lot of health issues. Those first 2 or 3 years, it was such good timing that I was there to help them. And now I'm really, COVID died back, the health of these people are at least stabilized, and I'm having the best time in my life. I just got married to Jack, who I met 2.5 years ago at Bike Happy Hour. So life is good. Retirement is awesome. Even though I loved my work, I also love all these things I'm doing now for free. So
You really seem to be thriving in those encore years. I think you're really demonstrating what David Brooks talks about and
thank you.
doing a great deal of communal existence.
Yes, yes, I do still really like people and finding ways to be among the people and being helpful and useful. And it's working out really well. Yeah,
Thank you so much for sharing, Carrie.
thanks.
Charlie, I'm gonna call on you next, who does not have video this evening. Um, but I wanted to ask you, Charlie, you leaned into a kind of different type of immortality than Odysseus. You dug into your family history and genealogy a lot after retiring. Um, would you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
now I'm unmuted, and I think my picture is on now working. Can
it is.
you see it?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, yeah. At Reed, I majored in economics, and I figured out early on that I'm really interested in economic history. And as it turned out, when I went to graduate school, I was never able to find an advisor who would help me on the concept of history along with economics. So I never quite finished my PhD, but I did end up with a long-term career in the investment management, strictly in economics, basically. That if you think about um, uh, your investments or your retirement fund, you know there's somebody in an office somewhere who's managing what those funds hold, and that's what our office did. So I spent 30 years in the investment management industry, and basically, all along I felt I really want to do more about history. And so when I got to the point where I could financially retire, and basically I retired at the age of 65, I figured, okay, it's time to switch over. So I retired at, at the end of 2019, 2 months before COVID kicked in. And at that point, I decided to switch over and focus on history instead of economics. And I've done a lot of things since then. I've been working, I live on Bainbridge Island, just west of Seattle. I've been working on I spent 9 years on the local history museum's board of directors, and now I'm spending 2 or 3 days a week volunteering at the historical. I wrote a 50-year history of our local Rotary Club, 75 years of 50-page history of our local Rotary Club at its 75th anniversary a couple of years ago. And so I'm basically enjoying working on history. Another focus I have on history is I'm very interested in Portland because my parents grew up in Portland. My grandparents both were there for their entire, my grandfathers were there for their entire. In fact, one great grandfather moved to Portland in the 1880s and was a chairman of the board of directors in the 1950. Anyway, I have a whole bunch of Portland history that I'm interested in too. And so basically the decision to retire partly was to be able to switch over and stop focusing on economics and focus on history instead.
Have you found challenges with that switch over? Like, has that been a difficult move for you?
Haven't really found too many. Part of the challenge in retirement is figuring out how to fit everything into the time. It's somehow, after working 30 years and figuring you have no time to do much of anything other than your work, it sort of seems like in retirement you ought to be able to have more spare time, and somehow that just doesn't seem to be working out. So I haven't been able to do quite as much as part of my plan when I retired, I figured I wanted to spend my first year traveling around the United States and my second year traveling internationally. And COVID kicked in 2 months after I retired. So both of those plans got completely eliminated. But basically, I'm thinking about a lot of different kinds of history and trying to figure out how to put it together. And getting organized is kind of a challenge. You know, it's unlike being a classroom when you've got you're told you should write a paper by such and such a date. I don't have a deadline to deal with, and so I just have a tendency. A lot of these things sort of go on forever.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a kind of delightful return all the way through the hero's journey back to the beginning again and getting to dig into the things that really excited
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Well, and it really is interesting, the research I've been doing in history. Even though I haven't necessarily written up a lot, I've been learning a lot more about history than I ever knew before in terms of reading up on the history of the United States and what was going on, you know, when Europeans came over to New England, those kinds of things. I never had much focus on that in the past, and so it's very interesting to me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Charlie. That transitions really fantastically into Diane Solomon, class of 1979. Diane, you talk a lot about not being able to fit everything into retirement and kind of weaning yourself in. Would you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yes, thank you. It's such a privilege to be here. I had many careers. I started out as a nurse and then certified nurse midwife, and then writer and editor, and then psychiatric nurse practitioner, and then also got a PhD in my 50s. So I obviously am either crazy and masochistic or like a lot of diversity, or both. And what led to me retiring, I was very privileged in that I was 63. I didn't think that I would ever retire. I had a private practice in downtown Portland as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. It was very fulfilling. And suddenly, a lot of people say, well, it was COVID. It was partly COVID. It was just that I had done the same thing for 20 years over and over again that made me suddenly realize I wanted to tell many of my patients, you know, you should really go talk to someone about that. And I realized that was not a good sign. And I was very privileged that I could retire. So I started weaning down my patient load, thinking every time I did that, that I'll enjoy this more if I'm not so full, and doing it all the time. But I kept doing it and it would help for a bit. And then I would feel like I just don't want to be doing this anymore. And finally, I weaned it down to 2 or 3 patients a week and then nothing. And I expected to love retirement immediately. And I found several things. First of all, it's a process. I'm now 2 years in, and I think I'm in a great point in that process. I'm really loving it. But also, I've noticed many of our peers are extremely anxious about retirement. I was somewhat anxious, and not anxious about the financial part, but what are we going to do? What will be my meaning and purpose? And I said, yeah, because I had those fears, I said yes to many things that as soon as I did them, I realized I do not need to be doing this. I'd rather be home reading a book than giving suicide trainings to EAPs, or I even tried an improv class, or I partnered with a Reed friend and bought a property that we're rehabbing, and several other psychiatric related, since that was my bailiwick. And I just, it took me about a year, because I had made all these commitments, to start saying, no, I can't do this. No, I don't want to be on this board. No, no, no. And learning to say no was a really important part, or so far, of my retirement journey. And finally, I realized I do not want to show up anywhere on anyone else's schedule more than once. I can, schedule a meeting or a lecture or what have you. But beyond that, I really wanted to reclaim my time. And I finally decided I wanted to volunteer. And I'm not as other serving as everyone who's gone before me, because I had served all my life. I have 4 children, a couple of them with special needs. I had more than one husband that I took care of, and I took care of patients for over 40 years. So I basically really disagreed with David Brooks's article, with all due respect, that this is the time to serve others. Because for me, this is the time to reclaim who I am and serve only those who I care to serve, and who can also serve me back in a reciprocal, mutually satisfying relationship, including my kids and loved ones. And I also found that David Brooks' conceptualization, I wouldn't be a good reader if I didn't say this, very androcentric and sort of Eastern seaboard, as so many people I know are successful, but haven't outdone their success to the exclusion of their taking care of their bodies, taking care of their psyches and minds and their well-being. And David Brooks seems to think that everyone in America who is successful has this workism. And I would say, unfortunately, men are in our society are probably much more trained to fall into that than women, who often, this is quite the stereotype, but women who are known to be more relational, for instance. Do I have anything else I want to say about this? I have been fascinated by people's anxieties about retirement. I've written about it. One of my encore things is to have a column in Psychology Today. And I've written and will continue to write about retirement as a process, and this anxiety about meaning and purpose as normative, and the need to be compassionate with ourselves about the process, and really give ourselves the time to experiment and dabble and try things until we land on something that we both enjoy and gives us purpose and meaning.
I really like the way you frame that, Diane, as a totally different approach to finding meaning and purpose in retirement, and it makes for a great counterpoint.
Thank you.
Becky in the comments, or Rebecca Chow, says that she's also thinking about what is the heroine's journey.
Actually, it's funny that there is a woman that is a Jungian that has written about the heroine's journey, and I think her last name is Custer, Marianne Custer, maybe. I'm not that familiar about it, but I did find this piece from the 80s by Ursula Le Guin about how male-oriented the hero's journey is. and it's very individualistic and involves a lot of violence and weapons, and really does not speak a lot to things that are more common in many women's lives. So thank you for bringing that up, and agree.
That's some fantastic nuance. Thank you. I will send out these recommendations, both the firecalc.com, some readings on retirement as a process, and I'll see if I can find Custer's works, and this Ursula Le Guin piece. So don't rush to take your notes. I've got you. I'll send these out in the follow-up to this meeting. At this point, we're going to transition and invite those of you who'd like to talk and talk about your own kind of journey, heroically or otherwise in your adventures. I'm going to invite you into breakout rooms so that you have a chance to talk with each other. Those are auto-timed for about 10 minutes. I ask you to be respectful of other folks' time in those spaces, try to make sure that everyone who wants to share has a chance to share, and then we'll come back here and wrap up. If we lose folks, though, I want to take a moment to just thank again each of our 3 panelists, and also Wally Englert, who took time out of their retirement and out of their commitment to all the other things that they do to speak with us this evening. This is really, really fantastic all, and I look forward to hosting more When Readies Retire events in the future to keep talking about what this looks like and how it looks so different for everyone. So thank you so much, and I'll see you all back here in about 10 minutes.